Jeffrey Dahmer. Date of birth, May 21st, 1960. Aliases, the Milwaukee Cannibal. Characteristic, rape, cannibalism, necrophilia, dismemberment. Number of victims, 17. Date of murders, 1978 to 1991. Date of arrest, July 1991. Murder method, throat cutting, strangulation. Known victims, Stephen Hicks, 19. Stephen Tuomi, 26. James Jamie Dockstader, 14. Richard Guerrero, 25. Anthony Sears, 26. Eddie Smith, 36. Ricky Beeks, 27. Ernest Miller, 22. David Thomas, 23. Curtis Straughter, 19. Errol Lindsay, 19. Tony Hughes, 31. Conorak Synthesymphone, 14. Matt Turner, 20. Jeremiah Weinberger, 23. Oliver Lacey, 23. Joseph Breithoff, 25. Crime location, Ohio, Wisconsin. Status, sentenced to 16 life sentences, murdered in prison on November 28, 1994. Background. Perhaps one of the most famous serial killers this century, Jeffrey Dahmer was the first of two children born to Lionel Herbert and Joyce Annette Dahmer. Lionel was a student of chemistry at Marquette University, and Joyce worked as an instructor of teletype machines. Both parents absolutely doted on Dahmer as an infant, but his mother was known to be a little difficult and attention-hungry. She would often get into arguments with her husband as well as the neighbors and was quite a tense person. When Dahmer started school, his mother spent more and more time laying in bed, supposedly recovering from weakness. Because his father was away a lot due to his studies, when he did come home, Joyce was constantly demanding his attention away from the children. Joyce would regularly work herself into an anxious state of small matters, and at one point, she attempted suicide by taking an overdose of the medication she had become addicted to. Because of his mother's issues, Dahmer and his brother received little attention from either parent. Dahmer later stated that their home life was one of extreme tension, especially between his parents who argued constantly. As a student, Dahmer was described as timid and quiet, and gave the sense that he was neglected at home. It was well known that his mother had illnesses and issues, and it was felt that this feeling of neglect Dahmer had was probably due to that. Dahmer did, however, have a small group of friends while he was at school. When Dahmer was around 4 years old, he watched as his father removed some animal bones from underneath the house, and as he played with the bones, he seemed excited by the noise they made. From then onwards, he developed a fascination for collecting bones, as well as collecting a variety of butterflies, dragonflies, and large insects, which he stored in jars. From there, he moved on to collecting animal carcasses that had been killed on the road. He would cut these bodies up, stating he was curious to see how the animal fitted together. He was fascinated by the position of the bones in live animals as well. At one point, Dahmer placed the head of a dog on a stake behind the house. When the second child was born in 1966, the family had moved to Doylestown, Ohio, and Dahmer was given the chance to choose his baby brother's name, and he chose David. By this time, his father Lionel had completed his degree and found work as an analytical chemist. 2 years later, the family up and moved again, this time to Bath, Ohio. In 1970, while the family was having chicken for dinner, Dahmer asked his father what would happen to the bones if they were put in a solution of bleach. Up until then, Lionel had been concerned about his elder son's quiet and rather solitary attitude, so was pleased to see him show an interest in science. He was happy to show Dahmer how to bleach and preserve animal bones, and these methods were used by Dahmer on the collection of animal remains he still gathered. Murders. The majority of Dahmer's victims were drugged with sedatives before being strangled to death. Sometimes he bludgeoned them to death, as was the case with his first and second victims. Ernest Miller, who was murdered on September 2, 1990, died from blood loss and shock after Dahmer had cut his carotid artery. A number of the victims killed in 1991 had holes drilled into their skull. Dahmer would then inject neurotic acid or boiling water through the holes into the brain. He did this to try and render the victim submissive and unable to resist. Although this wasn't intended to be a method of killing, 3 of Dahmer's victims died during the process. On June 18, 1978, Stephen Hicks had been hitchhiking to Chippewa Lake Park to see a rock concert. He was picked up by Dahmer, who then used a dumbbell to bludgeon Hicks before strangling him. His body was cut up into pieces, pulverized, and then scattered in the wooded area behind Dahmer's family home. Stephen Tuomi, 25, was killed by Dahmer at the Ambassador Hotel. but Dahmer can't remember actually killing him. He later said he must have been drunk when he beat him to death. His body was dismembered by Dahmer in his grandmother's basement, and the remains were put out in the trash. Dahmer met James Doxtator, 14, outside a gay bar and lured him to his home with the promise of earning $50 for some nude photos. Doxtator was strangled and his body kept in the basement for a week. He was then dismembered and discarded in the trash. On March 24, 1988, Richard Guerrero was killed in Dahmer's bedroom. He had been drugged before being strangled to death. His body was dismembered in the basement and the flesh put into acid to dissolve it. The bones went out in the trash, but he kept the skull for several months before getting rid of it. The last victim to be drugged and killed at Dahmer's grandmother's house was Anthony Sears, 24. He was killed on March 25, 1989, and after he was dismembered, Dahmer kept certain body parts. His genitals and his skull were preserved and later found in a filing cabinet in Dahmer's North 25th Street home. Raymond Smith was killed on May 20, 1990, and was the first to be killed at Dahmer's new apartment. Dahmer had met Smith, a prostitute, at a tavern and was invited back to the apartment. He was drugged with sleeping pills, then strangled. Dahmer painted his clean skull red and kept it. An acquaintance of Dahmer, Edward Smith, was last seen attending a party with Dahmer on June 14, 1990. After he was murdered, Dahmer used acid to destroy Smith's bones. He put the skull in the oven to try and dry it out, but accidentally destroyed it in the process. Dahmer had met Ernest Miller outside a bookstore. A dancer, Dahmer found Miller's physique attractive. Back at his apartment, Dahmer cut Miller's carotid artery, and after he had bled to death, dismembered his body in the bath. His skeleton was cleaned and stored in the filing cabinet, and his biceps, heart, and parts of his legs were frozen so they could be eaten at a later date. David Thomas, 22, met Dahmer near the Grand Avenue Mall on September 24, 1990. Dahmer offered to pay him for some nude photos, and Thomas agreed, accompanying Dahmer back to the apartment. His drink was laced with drugs, and once he was unconscious, Dahmer decided he wasn't my type, but killed him anyway. He took numerous photos of the body as he dismembered it. Dahmer lured Curtis Straughter back to the apartment on February 18, 1991. The young man was drugged, handcuffed, and then strangled. He was dismembered in the bath, and Dahmer kept his skull, genitals, and hands. On April 7, 1991, Errol Lindsay was the first victim Dahmer experimented on with his drilling into the skull technique. After he'd injected muriatic acid into Lindsay's brain, the young man awoke, so Dahmer gave him a drink containing sedatives. He then strangled him to death and removed his skin, which he kept for several weeks. He also kept Lindsay's skull. Dahmer used his usual offer of paying for nude photos to lure Tony Hughes to his apartment on May 24, 1991. Tony Hughes was a deaf mute. Dahmer and Hughes communicated by written notes. He was strangled and left on the floor of Dahmer's bedroom for 3 days. His body was then dismembered, and once again, Dahmer took photos of the process. His skull was kept and used for identification purposes later. Conorak Synthesymphone 14 was drugged and put through the process of the skull drilling and acid being injected into his brain on May 27, 1991. Thinking the boy was incapacitated, Dahmer went to the store to buy some beer, and when he got back, Synthesymphone was out in the street, naked and asking for help. When the police arrived, Dahmer told them the boy was intoxicated and that they were lovers. Incredibly, the police left him in Dahmer's care in his apartment. More acid was then injected into his brain, which accidentally killed him. His body was dismembered, and Dahmer kept his head in the freezer. Dahmer came across Matt Turner at a bus stop on June 30, 1991, and Dahmer used his photo ruse to lure him back to his apartment. Once inside, Turner was given a laced drink, then strangled. Like the others, he was dismembered in the bath. His torso was put in a 57-gallon drum, and his internal organs and head were kept in the freezer. At a Chicago gay bar on July 5, 1991, Dahmer met Jeremiah Weinberger, who agreed to spend the weekend with Dahmer. After drugging Weinberger, Dahmer drilled into his skull and injected boiling water into his brain. Apparently, his eyes were open when he died. His head was cut off and his body left in the bath for a week before being cut up. His torso also went into the drum. The payment for photos ruse was used once again on Oliver Lacey, 24, a bodybuilding enthusiast, on July 15, 1991. Lacey was drugged, then strangled with a leather strap. His head was cut off and placed in the refrigerator with his heart. Dahmer kept his skeleton as he was planning on using it to create a shrine of the skulls and bones he had collected. Dahmer's last victim was Joseph Breithoff. He was murdered on July 19, 1991 and left on Dahmer's bed for 2 days. His head was removed on July 21st and put into the refrigerator. His torso ended up in the drum along with that of Weinberger and Turner. Timeline of murders. November 18, 1978, Stephen Hicks, 18. November 20th, 1987, Stephen Tuomi, 25. January 16th, 1988, James Doxtator, 14. March 24th, 1988, Richard Guerrero, 22. March 25th, 1989, Anthony Sears, 24. May 20th, 1990, Raymond Smith, 32. June 14th, 1990, Edward Smith, 27. September 2nd, 1990, Ernest Miller, 22. September 24th, 1990, David Thomas, 22. February 18th, 1991, Curtis Straughter, 17. April 7th, 1991, Errol Lindsay, 19. May 24th, 1991, Tony Hughes, 31. May 27th, 1991, Conrad Synthesymphone, 14. June 30th, 1991, Matt Turner, 20. July 5th, 1991, Jeremiah Weinberger, 23. July 15th, 1991, Oliver Lacey, 24. July 19th, 1991, Joseph Breithoff, 25. Arrest and trial. On July 22, 1991, Dahmer talked to 3 men and offered $100 to come back to his apartment and take some nude photos, hang out, and drink beer. Tracy Edwards, one of the men, agreed. When they got inside the apartment, he noticed a terrible stench and multiple boxes of acid sitting on the floor. At one point, Dahmer told him to turn and look at his fish, and as he did so, Dahmer put a handcuff on his wrist. He failed to handcuff both wrists, but was still able to convince Edwards to go into his bedroom with him to take the photos. In the corner of the room was a large drum from which a terrible smell emanated. Dahmer made a number of threats towards Edwards, brandishing a knife, and Edwards continued to try and stop Dahmer from attacking him by appeasing him, all the while looking for a way to escape. At one point, he was able to convince Dahmer that they should go back out to the living room and have a beer. Edwards got up from the couch after stating he needed to use the bathroom and noticed Dahmer wasn't holding the handcuffs or the knife and was distracted. Edwards punched Dahmer in the face, then knocked him off balance, and then ran straight out the front door of the apartment. Outside on the street, Edwards flagged down 2 police officers. He asked them to remove the handcuff on his wrist, and when they were unable to, he took them up to Dahmer's apartment. Dahmer admitted he had put the handcuffs on Edwards, but didn't explain why. The officers were told that the key was in Dahmer's bedroom, a lapse in his judgment, and when the officers went in, they noticed a bunch of photos in a drawer that was open. The photos were of the dismembered bodies, and it was obvious they had been taken in Dahmer's apartment. Dahmer tried to fight with the officers, but was overcome and arrested. On searching his apartment after his arrest, the following items were found: 4 severed heads, 7 skulls, blood drippings on a tray in the refrigerator, 2 human hearts, part of an arm muscle, a torso, a bag of organs and flesh, 2 whole skeletons, 2 hands, 2 penises that had been preserved, a scalp, 3 torsos in the drum, 74 photos of dismembered bodies. Dahmer was charged with 16 counts of first-degree murder and, despite his history, was found to be legally sane and able to stand trial. He was subsequently convicted and sentenced on February 15, 1992 to 15 terms of life imprisonment. He was charged and convicted of a 16th murder later and received another life sentence. Outcome. At around 8:10 a.m. on November 28, 1994, Dahmer was found on the floor of the prison's gym bathroom, having suffered horrific injuries to his head and face. He had been in the area along with Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver as part of their usual work detail. Anderson was also critically injured, and both had been struck repeatedly by a 20-inch metal bar, as well as struck against the wall multiple times. Both men were still alive when they were discovered, but Dahmer died an hour later after being rushed to the hospital. Anderson succumbed to his injuries and died 2 days later. Scarver, who was already sentenced to life for a previous murder, informed the prison authorities that he had attacked both men immediately after returning to his cell. He claimed, "God told me to do it." He received 2 more life sentences for the murders of Dahmer and Anderson. Later, in 2015, Scarver changed his story and said that both men had poked him in the back and then laughed at him. He alleged Dahmer would taunt fellow inmates by shaping his food to look like body parts, and that Dahmer showed no remorse for his horrific crimes. In Dahmer's will, he had requested there be no funeral service for him and he was to be cremated. His ashes were subsequently divided between his parents. Trivia. His IQ was estimated to be around 145, putting him close to being at genius level. Quotes by Dahmer. "I carried it too far, that's for sure. I've got to start eating at home more. I made my fantasy life more powerful than my real one. I think in some way I wanted it to end, even if it meant my own destruction. I would cook it and look at the pictures and masturbate. My consuming lust was to experience their bodies. I viewed them as objects, as strangers. It is hard for me to believe a human being could have done what I've done. I couldn't find any meaning for my life when I was out there. I'm sure as hell not going to find it in here. This is the grand finale of a life poorly spent, and the end result is just overwhelmingly depressing. It's just a sick, pathetic, wretched, miserable life story. That's all it is. How it can help anyone, I've no idea."